Hewitt was telling the boys and girls just a few minutes ago about our new Sunday school curriculum, Godly Play. It is a really nice program for youngsters, and you may have noticed from earlier in the summer at some point, if you looked at the worship calendar as we printed in the bulletin insert, that we were hoping to have a special guest speaker with us today, someone who's a trainer, an advocate for this Godly Play program with the United Church, and she was going to come and do a demonstration for all of us together of how the lesson is taught and how the biblical stories are told. And well, within the last month, something came up and she had to cancel for today, but we're still hoping to have her with us on a future date to be determined, so that we all can see together the really engaging way that the stories are told, and that the children are invited into the telling and the retelling of the stories. And so I say all of that just to invite you to keep your eyes open for our advertisement of that day when it comes, and we'll have some notice through the bulletin insert and the newsletter. Now, to the subject of our reading for today, which is on the theme of perseverance in faith and endurance in our journey of faith life. I don't need to tell any of you that at times life can be immensely challenging. We go through periods of great difficulty that can be almost completely overwhelming. And it doesn't matter who we are, men or women, young or old, rich or poor. It doesn't matter where we're born or where we live, what part of the world we come from, what our cultural background is, even what our religious beliefs and faith are. There is no avoiding the fact that at times we're going to go through great hardships in our lives. And our faith in God, if we have such a faith, is going to be put to the ultimate test. Some of you may know the name Sheryl Sandberg. She's an executive with Facebook, the company, the corporation that operates the very popular website. And a number of years ago, life for her was going absolutely terrifically. Her career was a success. She had a beautiful family. She had a young husband with whom she was in love, and they were financially successful, and life was somewhat of a dream. Until one week they were on vacation in Mexico, and her healthy, young, vibrant husband dropped dead suddenly of a heart attack. He had one of those heart defects that goes undiagnosed and unknown, and until it's too late. It's like a ticking time bomb inside us. And her world was shattered. She went from the absolute mountaintop of life to the deepest valley. She was in despair. She's gone on to do some writing about this experience, and she says that no matter who we are, we may experience great loss, or illness, or injury, or divorce, or rejection, personal disappointment, a professional failure. Whatever it is, all of us are living through some form of what we might call Plan B. Life has not gone as we intended it to or wanted it to. And so we're left trying to pick up the pieces and to struggle through some difficult situation or some combination of incredibly challenging circumstances. And when we find ourselves in situations like that, it can put our faith, if we are people of faith, to a great test. You see, when life is at its most difficult, and when circumstances seem to be at their most unfair, it is only natural that we start to question, where is God in all of this? Is there a God at all who could let these things happen to me or to my family? If there is a God, does God even care about what I or we are going through? It's incomprehensible to us how a good and a powerful and a loving God could possibly be at work in the midst of some of the greatest trials we face. And very often, if we have a faith, we are just clinging to it with our fingernails. We may find even that our faith is a hindrance to moving forward with a happy life. And we may want to give it up altogether. Well, most of you know that I'm a sports fan, and if I have the good pleasure of relaxing and watching a bit of television now and then, I'm more likely as not to turn on the sports channel. And some months ago, I was watching a program about the Ironman Triathlon World Championship, which is held every year in October in Hawaii. And the Ironman Triathlon is, if not the most grueling physical test in the world of athletics, it's certainly one of them. The contestants start out by swimming in the open ocean about 3 kilometers, and then once they get out of the water, they cycle or on their bicycle for 180 kilometers. And once they're done that incredibly long bike ride, they then run a marathon. And the elite competitors in this competition can finish all of this incredible racing in maybe 10 hours or a little bit less. They're incredibly fit. And the competition consists not only of professional triathletes who compete and train all year round. There is alongside an amateur competition. People just like you and me, except in really good shape, and they can qualify to compete in this race. And I was most struck as I was watching this particular program about the 2015 Ironman competition by the remarkable circumstances of a Canadian triathlete from British Columbia named Jeff Simmons. He's a professional, and he had entered the race with the hope of, if not winning, I mean that would have taken a bit of luck, but certainly finishing very high up in the race and putting down a good time and achieving a very remarkable result. And 140 kilometers into the bicycle portion of the race, some bolts came loose on the right-hand pedal of his bike. And for a handful of kilometers, the use of the right-hand pedal became more and more difficult until ultimately the pedal stopped working altogether. It could not be turned in a way to help propel the chain and make the bike move forward. And so he was gradually adapting to the technical failure of the bike, and he got the pedal in a position where it wasn't going to be in his way, and he started pedaling with his left leg only. And he kept going, but he thought about quitting, and in fact he wanted to quit. Next to 180 kilometers, maybe 40 kilometers doesn't sound like that long of a ride, but you try riding 40 kilometers with one leg. You wouldn't want to carry on either. Paul read just a few moments ago for us from the letter to the Hebrews, and Paul touched on some of the mysteries of that particular biblical document. It is a letter. We do not know by whom, and we don't know exactly to whom. Likely it was written to followers of Jesus who by background were Jewish and living perhaps in Jerusalem or in another area of Palestine. And they were experiencing great persecution for having become followers of Jesus. Perhaps persecutions like losing their jobs. Is my microphone no? I'll just come here, Peter. I'll just use this, Peter. I think maybe the batteries died. Because there's no power. Okay. These Jewish followers of Jesus were experiencing great persecutions. Persecutions not just like mocking or sneering, but real hardships. Perhaps they were losing their jobs. Maybe they were having their businesses sabotaged. Maybe they were losing their homes. Maybe they were having their families divided. Some may even have been put in prison, all for their faith. And just like we would, they began to wonder how God could possibly be at work in the trials they were experiencing. Not only was their faith not producing outward blessings, it was causing them great suffering. And naturally they began to wonder, how could God be at work if simply for putting our faith in God in the way that we thought we were supposed to do, we are suffering? And so they were thinking about giving up their faith altogether. And this writer, who is unknown to us, wrote a letter of encouragement. And that letter of encouragement said, among other things, this is nothing new. Think of all those people of faith who came before you, who suffered for what they believed and for being obedient to the call of God on their lives. In the 11th chapter of the letter, just before the lines that we heard, there is a list of great biblical heroes and an example of the suffering that they endured for their own faith in God. Think of Noah, said the writer. Noah built the boat on dry land before there was any sign of the rain. Think of the mocking Noah endured from his friends and neighbors. Think of Abraham, who was called suddenly and unexpectedly to leave his homeland and go to another place to be determined at the call of God. He uprooted everything and went. Think of his wife Sarah, who was promised by God a child in her old age, for she had never been able to have one. And she was forced for years, therefore, to live with the painful hope that maybe what God had said to her was true. Maybe. Think about Moses, who was called to lead the Israelites through the wilderness. And not only did he himself have to live in the misery of this wilderness wandering, but he had to live with the ungrateful grumbling of his followers. There were many such examples as these, says the writer of the letter to the Hebrews. What you're experiencing is nothing new. It is somehow part of God's plan. And these great biblical heroes did not have the benefit that you have. They did not live long enough to see the ultimate promise of God in the person of Jesus, as you have been able to see him. Jesus is famously called in this section of the letter, which we heard, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. I'm not sure if that's quite right. Looking at the original language, we might say the beginning and the end of faith. What I think is being got at here is to say that Jesus is both the intention of faith and the goal or the result of faith. I think the writer is here alluding to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. For you see, in the cross, we see the intention of faith. We see God's intention that we would put our trust in God and live obediently no matter what. That is the intention of faith. But then there is the goal or the result of faith, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. That the ultimate goal that someday we will reach through the path of our faithful obedience is the victory of God, first expressed and promised, and yet also guaranteed in the resurrection of Jesus, of whom the writer says, he, for the sake of the joy set before him, endured the shame of the cross, and who now sits at the right hand of the throne of God. Look to him in all circumstances, in good and in bad. He is the reason for our race, and he is the finish line. A number of years ago, when I was a university student, I had the good fortune for a couple of summers to work on the grounds crew at a golf course, and I enjoyed that job. One of the important things that you do when you cut the grass at the golf course is to make sure that you cut straight lines, you know. When you cut the grass, you lay down the grain. You push the blades of grass in a certain direction, and then when you're coming back, you're pushing them in the opposite direction, and that's how come you see the lighter and the darker stripes on the freshly cut grass. And it's very important that the lines you cut are very straight. Now let me tell you, when you're trying to cut the fairway on the golf course, and maybe you're cutting for 100 yards in one direction and coming back 100 yards in the other, and so on and so forth over bumpy and rolling and uneven ground, it's really difficult to cut in a straight line. And I can guarantee you that if you're trying to cut the grass over such terrain, that if you look at the ground in front of you and you try to make all these little minor adjustments for every hump and hollow, you're going to get to the end of your cut and you're going to see all kinds of wavy, ugly lines. And the superintendent, your boss, is going to give you an earful. But there is a way to cut those straight lines. You don't look at the ground in front of you or around you. You pick some target out in the distance, maybe a tree trunk or a fence post. And the more uneven the ground, the more intently you have to fix your eyes on that target in the distance and not look away. And you stare and you cut right towards that object. And if you do that pass after pass, you will look back and you will see that you have cut beautiful, straight lines. In our faith, Jesus is that target out in the distance. And the more difficult our journey, the more humps and hollows there are, the more intently we must fix our gaze upon him. Of course, I wouldn't have brought up to you this story of triathlete Jeff Simmons if there was not a remarkable ending to his story. He pedaled those 40 kilometers with one leg, and he was passed by numerous athletes who had previously been behind him. When he got to the end of the cycling portion of the race, he was beside himself. I mean, you can imagine that this competition is so intense and so difficult that one significant challenge would be enough to put you out of the race, because you just would not have enough energy left over to get to the end in such a circumstance. And while he was proud of himself for having not given up on the bike, he got to the transition area with a marathon lying before him, 26 miles of running, and with now no hope of achieving a worthwhile result for a professional. He had virtually made up his mind to quit. He was in tears. And then his fiancée, who had been waiting in the transition area, came out onto the road beside him and offered him some words of encouragement. And then some friends of his who had traveled to Hawaii and made a bit of a vacation of it to come and support him, they began shouting encouragement from the other side of the tape as they watched from the side of the road. And then he began to think about all the amateur competitors who had made great sacrifices to come and just to attempt the completion of this race. Of all the time off work they had to take in order to train and to come on holiday to Hawaii. And he thought particularly of those amateurs who were competing with significant physical disabilities. You know, there are people who enter this triathlon competition needing wheelchairs and other kinds of assistive devices, people with prosthetic limbs, people with significant vision impairment. And he thought about this great cloud of witnesses. And he ran a remarkable marathon, just a few short minutes off the Canadian record for a marathon runner. And he finished his race not on the podium, but with a very impressive time and an even more remarkable display of endurance and character. And he became an even greater source of inspiration. Of course, that doesn't mean that God is calling all of us to become athletes like that, or that God is calling us to finish some kind of race in that sense. Maybe it is that God is calling us to give something up, to reprioritize. You, of course, know the story of Eric Liddell, who in the 1920s was the world's fastest man. And he looked forward to likely winning gold at the Paris Olympics. But he decided not to run because the final race of the competition was to be held on a Sunday, and in his faith he did not feel that he could run in a race on the Lord's day. And so to run more faithfully the race of life in faith that God had set before him, he gave up this other good thing. And sometimes it is for our faith. We have to give up something that is good, something that is important to us. Famous missionary Elizabeth Elliot, in her well-known sermon, The Path of Endurance, says that our faithfulness is built in the midst of challenges, one step at a time, day after day, year after year. We face great trials and challenges. All of us do. But you know what? God can work even in the midst of those in ways we can scarcely imagine or comprehend. God certainly uses them to help us to grow and to mature as people. God uses them to draw us closer in faith. In any circumstances and at all times, God walks with us. And God not only walks with us, God empowers and enables us. So continue to run or walk or be carried along the race of your journey through life. It will be well worth it, and a great reward awaits. Praise be to God. Amen.